Story 1. Encountering Banff National Park. I was going through a rough patch, fresh from a painful breakup, and I needed to escape, to clear my head, to feel alive again. Banff National Park in Canada seemed like the perfect place. The park was a nature preserve with towering peaks, crystal clear lakes, and endless trails. I packed my bags and set out, determined to leave my troubles behind, if only for a day. After hiking for what seemed like hours, I found the perfect spot, a sheer cliff that was begging to be climbed. I wrapped a rope around a sturdy tree at the top, preparing for a rope climb. The sun was shining, the air was fresh, and for the first time in days, I felt at peace. As I rappelled down the cliff, I noticed something odd. A large, dark hole in the rock, a cave entrance that seemed out of place so high up. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to explore. I had enough rope to lower myself inside, and I figured I might find something interesting. The thought of a hidden cave excited me, promising a distraction from the storm in my mind. I descended into the cave, my headlamp illuminating the narrow passage. The air grew colder, the walls damp and slippery. I went deeper, my footsteps echoing on the rock, until I turned a corner and entered a larger chamber. It was then that I noticed the stench, pungent, as if something had died. I gagged, covering my mouth with my sleeve, but something compelled me to continue. My headlamp flickered, and for a moment I was plunged into darkness. When the light returned, I froze. Standing at the end of the room were two figures. They were pale, almost sickly looking, their clothes ragged and dirty. Their eyes locked on mine, and I felt a wave of fear wash over me. Before I could react, they began to move toward me, slowly at first, then faster. Their faces were expressionless, but their intention was clear. They were coming for me. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, their footsteps growing louder behind me. The passage seemed to close in on me, darkness closing in on me from all sides. I could feel their cold breath on my neck, terror driving me forward. I reached the cave entrance and tried to pull myself up with the rope. My hand slipped on the wet rock, but I clung on, climbing as fast as I could. I didn't look back, but I could hear them. They were still coming. I reached the top, and without hesitation, I cut the rope, sending it plummeting into the darkness below. For a moment, I stood there, gasping for breath, trying to process what had just happened. But I couldn't stay. I had to get out of there. I gathered my things and ran down the mountain, my legs shaking with exhaustion and fear. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves made my heart race, convinced that they were still watching me. When I finally reached my car, I collapsed into the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I drove out of the park without a backward glance, leaving behind whatever horrors lurked in that cave. That night, I couldn't sleep. The images of those pale figures haunted me, their empty eyes and lifeless expressions burned into my mind. I reported the cave to park officials the next day, but they found nothing. No cave, no people, no evidence of what I had seen. It was as if the whole experience had been a nightmare, but I knew better. I haven't been back to Banff since. The mountains, once a place of comfort, now filled me with a sense of abject dread. I tried to make sense of what I had seen. Maybe it was a hallucination or a trick of light and shadow, but deep down, I knew the truth. There was something in that cave, something not of this world, and I had come too close to it. Story 2. Meeting in the Adirondack Park. We were a tight-knit group of outdoor enthusiasts, our friendships forged over countless hikes, climbs, and camps. This time, it was just the four of us, James, DeVito, Christina, and me, taking on the rugged trails of the Adirondack Park. October had already painted the forest in a kaleidoscopic array of fall colors, and the crisp air invigorated us as we ventured deeper into the wilderness. As night fell, we realized we needed to set up camp before darkness completely enveloped us. The terrain was rough and treacherous, but we found a relatively flat spot to pitch our tent. James and I, being the only guys, carried the extra weight of the tent and helped set it up while the girls gathered wood for the fire. Soon we were all sitting around the fire, the warmth providing comfort as we told stories and laughed. But then the night turned. A piercing scream broke the silence, echoing down the mountain like the cry of a demon. It was a woman's scream, horrifying and terrifying. We all froze, the sound sending a chill down my spine. The forest, so alive with the sounds of nature, fell deathly silent. No one moved, no one spoke. We just stared at each other, the unspoken question hanging in the air. What was that? Minutes passed, and the scream did not repeat. We began to discuss what we should do, our voices hushed, as if afraid to disturb whatever lurked in the darkness. Then a loud boom echoed down the mountain, sharp and unnatural. It wasn't a gunshot, but it was unsettling enough to make us put out the fire and retreat into our tents. We didn't want to advertise our presence to anyone, anything out there. James and I shared one tent, the girls another. The tension was palpable as we lay there, every rustle of leaves outside making me jump. I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying that scream, that terrible sound. Time passed, and just as I was starting to drift off, it happened again. A scream, higher and much closer, ripped through the night. I jumped up, my heart pounding in my chest. James was awake, eyes wide with fear. The scream came from just outside our campsite. We whispered frantically, debating whether to wait, but before we could decide, we heard it. Footsteps crunching on the rocky ground outside our... DeVito? Christina? I called, my voice barely above a whisper. There was no answer. The footsteps stopped just outside our tent. I could feel the tension radiating from James as we stared at each other, paralyzed with fear. Then the tent began to shake violently. Someone or something was outside, trying to get in. We screamed, and the girls in the other tent screamed back. In a moment of pure terror, I yelled to James, "On the count of 3, we go out and fight." I started counting, my voice shaking. But as soon as I counted to 2, the shaking stopped. We didn't hesitate. I unzipped the tent and we rushed outside, expecting to face whatever had tormented us. But there was nothing, no one. The darkness was oppressive, the trees casting long, menacing shadows in the pale moonlight. Whoever had been there was gone, gone into the night. We ran to the girls' tent, adrenaline pumping. They were out, clutching their packs. We clutched ours too, unwilling to leave anything behind despite the danger. Together, we ran down the mountain, stumbling in the dark, guided only by the pale. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of a leaf sent us into a panic, convinced that something was following us. Hours passed before we finally reached the car, our bodies aching from the frantic descent. James drove us off that cursed mountain, and only then, when we had gone miles, did we stop to sleep. We slept in the car, exhausted and terrified, haunted by the screams that still echoed in our minds. The next day, As we recounted our terrifying experience to the rest of the group, we realized how lucky we had been. To this day, no one knows what happened in that forest. There have been no reports of strange happenings or murders, but that night, that scream, and the unseen presence outside our tent, that is something I will never forget. It was the scariest, most terrifying night of my life. Story 3. Meeting Everest. My uncle had always been the daredevil in the family, the one who thrived on adrenaline and pushing the limits of danger. His stories were legendary: rock climbing, whitewater rafting, skydiving, but nothing could compare to his attempt to climb Everest, a feat that changed him in ways none of us could have imagined. I was just a child when he climbed the mountain, but even I noticed a change in him afterward. The man who had been the life of every family gathering became quieter, more introverted. It was years later that he told me what really happened on that mountain, and the story he shared still haunts me. My uncle went alone, a decision that may have been his first mistake. He had always been a solo adventurer, but Everest was different. The danger was on a whole other level. He spent a day at base camp, acclimatizing to the thin air before. At first, things went smoothly, but as he climbed higher, the air thinned and the landscape became more treacherous. As he entered the death zone, the area above 8,000 meters where oxygen is scarce and death is a constant companion, he encountered his first dead body. It lay in a ravine, a grim reminder of the mountain's deadly power. The sight of it shook him to the core. My uncle, who had always been so full of life, suddenly felt his own mortality pressing down on him. As he continued to climb, the effects of the altitude began to take their toll. He became dizzy, lightheaded, and disoriented. He sat down to rest, overwhelmed by exhaustion, and the image of the dead climber seared into his mind. He began talking to himself, trying to stay sane, but the more he talked, the more surreal it became. That was when he saw him, the climber. The man seemed to appear out of nowhere, passing my uncle and urging him to keep climbing. My uncle tried to explain that he was too tired, that he needed to turn back, but the man's voice was strange, echoing, as if it were coming from far away. My uncle shrugged, thinking it was just the height giving him a headache. But as he walked down the mountain, the man kept appearing, always a few steps behind, always smiling, always gesturing for my uncle to turn back. My uncle tried to ignore him, but the man wouldn't leave him alone. Finally, my uncle stopped and firmly told the man that he wasn't going to go up again. That's when the man smiled one last time and said, "Watch me go over the cliff." Before my uncle could react, the man had reached the edge of the cliff and jumped, disappearing from sight. My uncle rushed to the edge of the cliff, his heart pounding, but there was no one there. No body, no tracks, nothing. He was alone. The shock of what he had just witnessed snapped him out of his daze. He rushed down the mountain as fast as he could, but the height, the fear, the exhaustion, it was all too much. The last thing he remembered was darkness, and then he woke up at base camp in the medical clinic. He had passed out and had to be rescued by other climbers who found him and brought him to safety. It wasn't until he got home that he learned about a young climber who had died on Everest that same week, a man who looked eerily similar to the figure he had seen. My uncle had been off his medication during the climb, and he knew that altitude could cause hallucinations, but the timing, the details, it all made him doubt what he had actually seen. To this day, he's not sure if the figure was a hallucination or something more sinister. Whatever it was, it left a mark on him, one he's never been able to erase. Everest broke something inside him, and even now, years later, the memory of that ghostly encounter haunts him. He climbed the world's tallest mountain, but in the end, it wasn't the mountain that defeated him. It was the fear that something beyond the natural world had taken notice of him.